Hi, friends, fellow evolvers, and curious people everywhere. Welcome to this episode of Being with Sally Wilson. I'm Sally Wilson, and I feel so privileged to have as my guest today, our guest today, Deborah Ellis. Welcome, Deb.
Thank you for having me on your show. Hello from Canada.
Yeah, so Deb lives in Ontario, right, Deb?
Yes.
Yep. And she is an author, a peace activist, a feminist, and when we're going to talk about that, I'm really interested in what that means to you, Deb, and an all-round extraordinary woman who walks her talk. And I'm so pleased and grateful that you've made time to be with us today and to share some of your insights and thoughts and ideas with us. So thank you once again, Deb.
Oh, happy to do that.
So, Deb, the books of yours that introduced me to you are actually books that you wrote a while ago, I think. My 11-year-old niece, she was 10 when she recommended Pavana, the first Pavana book to me. She makes book recommendations to me, and they're all fabulous. And you've written about children, so you're a children's writer. You've written about children from the point of view of children from
Mhm.
all over the world.
Mhm.
Can you just talk us through how this all started?
Oh, sure. I kind of fell into it. I've been writing for many years, very unsuccessfully, not getting published. And then I published a book in uh, Canada called Looking for X, which is also published in Australia. And because I had a publisher who was willing to look at things that I was doing, when I was starting to get involved in Afghanistan and I had this idea for a children's book about Afghanistan, then they took that book on as well. And then things just started to roll from there. Uh, I hadn't planned on being an author for children. I fell into it because that's who would publish my stuff. But it's been an incredible thing to be able to do because we don't ordinarily get to hear the voices of children in extreme circumstances. And I think we need to because it's very easy to forget that they exist. It's easy to think that either they're okay or that their pain doesn't matter. And it's easy for us to discount them. Uh, but what the world does, what the adult world does, has direct, real impact upon the lives of children, which is kind of a silly thing to say because, of course, it does, but we don't think about it. And they certainly think about it. They can see it, they can feel it, they can understand it, they have opinions about it. And we need to pay attention to that.
Yeah. And when I was reading about you, I was curious because I thought, this writer obviously has such insight into what these children are going through. I mean, insight in terms of almost, you would think, firsthand experience. um, and it became clear as I read more about you that you really have. You've been to these places, you've talked to children, you know what's going on. Can you just talk about some of your experiences visiting these places, like, Afghanistan, like Pakistan, and talking to those children?
Sure. I had forgotten that Afghanistan existed, like I think a lot of people, at least in Canada, back in 1996 when the Taliban took over the first time, and the news of that takeover hit the Toronto papers, and the terrible crimes against women were being written about and talked about. So, as a feminist, I wanted to do something and did a few little things in Toronto to raise some money, but I thought that if we could get a better idea of who these women were and are, and what all of this meant to them, and what they needed, and maybe what we could help them get, that would be a useful thing to do. And so I went to the Afghan refugee camps in Pakistan. First of all, we're really lucky in Canada. We're able to welcome refugees here from all over the world, as you can do in Australia. So we have a large Afghan refugee and immigrant community here. And they had a lot of people still back in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so I got to meet people here who introduced me to people there, and that so on and so forth. You meet some person, they introduce you to more people. And I learned about the many decades of war leading up to the Taliban takeover that made it possible for the Taliban to take the country over, and the different types of survivors of those periods of war, all leading up to what's like now, what it was like then under the Taliban, and of course what it's like now under the Taliban. So that was the first time I'd done that kind of a trip, and it was really quite incredible to learn about the things that we have in common, but also the things that we have that are different, and the way that the big world, the big decisions of powerful people in the world, the impact of that on lives of families and what that means to the people involved. It was quite stunning to me.
Yeah, yeah. I think if for a lot of us in privileged, wealthy nations, those of us who are not homeless, those of us who are doing okay, who are living lives, we're safe, we can get enough food, we have all of the basics, okay. It's easy to look at struggle and difficulty and think, what difference can I make? Seriously, what difference can I make? But you've been one of these people who's looked at others' difficulties and struggles and thought, there is a difference I can make, and I'm going to make it. For people who are listening, how would you, and they're thinking, well, okay, all right, well, she did it, well, maybe I can. How would you suggest they start?
Well, I think listening is probably the greatest place to start. If someone is interested in supporting women in different parts of the world, the best thing to first do is to meet with people who are from that part of the world and find out if what we think they need is the same thing that they think that they need, and if there's a way that we can use our skills to assist them to do what they need to do in their lives, and put ourselves in their shoes. What would we want if we were in that situation, and how would we want the world to look at us and talk with us and listen to us? That's a really good first step. And I mean, there are so many ways around the world now that people can plug in to support people in ways that are doing things that are already meaningful to you. So if you love agriculture, there's tons of ways to plug into people who are struggling without agriculture, and learn from what they're doing. And there's tons of ways to do that now that there weren't when I was growing up.
Yeah. And I think it's also a matter of not underestimating the power of one positive action or one conversation that you listen, somebody's experience that you listen to, right? It's really honoring the small things we can all do. And you've gone on and you've done huge things. I mean, you've donated so much of your royalties to charities, homeless children, women. I'd love to hear what your definition, sounds like a very sort of dry word, but what your definition of feminism is, what it means to you.
It means that the women in the world have the capacity they should have the capacity to grow to whatever capacity they have, and there shouldn't be barriers against that. And if those barriers are gone for the women in the world, then they will be gone for the men in the world. They will be gone for the people who see themselves as different from both men and women, or it's about removing those barriers so that we're not held back by artificial stories about who we are. And we need to just, my wife and I were talking about this the other day, about at some point in women's lives, we get to not hate our bodies anymore. There must be at some age where we can be, where we don't like take on the trash of the world on our shoulders anymore, when we were free of that. And is it when we're 50? Do we get to be free of that when we're 50? Do you have to wait till 55? Like, there's got to be some point where we don't have to deal with that anymore. And so any step that we take to free ourselves from those kinds of rigid stories that are against us, those are steps that we also take to free other people in the world from the stories that have held them down as well. And as a storyteller, I think that's one of the things that I can bring to the table for new people coming up, young people coming up, is to say, here's a different way of looking at something. Here's a different way of looking at this situation, this person in this situation. What can we learn from this that's a little different from maybe how we thought before? And that's big stuff.
Yes. I remember when you talk about women and, what point do we get to just love our bodies? Do we get to just be okay with it? I remember, so I don't know if you know, Deb, but my background was in opera. So I was an opera singer. Well, I sort of still am.
Cool.
But
Very cool.
the reason I'm mentioning that is that there are no female opera singers with grey hair. Actually, there was one that I saw a photo of kind of early on in my career. One, and she was Canadian, I think. And she had short cropped grey hair. Now, when I chose to, so I went along with it. I was like, well, I have to dye my hair when it started to go grey. I was like, well, no one's gonna see me because they can't imagine me with, I mean, look, when we're in opera, we're made up. We're wearing wigs and stuff anyway. Like we're playing characters that we're not. I was playing boys half the time,
Wow.
And still, I thought, no, if I'm audition with grey hair, not going to work well for me. And I was probably right. But I remember, because that's just what that world is, right? It's still very conservative, largely. And I remember some of the responses I got when I was like, you know what? Stuff it. I'm letting it just go. I'm so sick of this. I feel like I'm hiding something of myself. And I remember some of the responses I got. It was so crazy. I mean, friends saying, oh, no, I'm not going to let you do that.
Wow.
I was like, what? Huh? And male and female, and it was kind of astounding. And the freedom that I felt when I was just, it was just great. And you know what? I love it. It was so liberating. And and then I looked at all the women around me and I thought maybe their experience is different. Maybe dyeing their hair isn't a burden. Maybe they don't feel like they're hiding something. But I thought, well, if I did, I bet there are a lot of people out there who do, who feel like they're hiding stuff. They're just not free to be them anyway. That was, just a very small example, but it's just, I think that's the thing. Half the time we don't even realize it's happening to us. We don't even realize that we've been indoctrinated in that way because it's our normal.
It's our normal. That's right. And it doesn't need to be. We can get rid of that.
Absolutely.
We can get rid of that.
Yeah. There are a couple of quotes that I saw on your website, Deb, that really spoke to me. And I just thought, ooh, I actually need a few weeks to think about this. But one of them was, or is, we create the world we want to see. What do you mean by that?
I don't remember creating that quote. It sounds like something Gandhi said, actually, to be the change you wish to see in the world. But certainly in books, we can create ourselves as braver than we are, as wiser than we are, and willing to take more chances than we might in our regular lives. So as authors, we have certainly power to create the kind of world where maybe things work out sometimes a little bit better, especially for if you're writing literature for young people. I firmly believe that every book has to end on a hopeful note. Doesn't mean that everything's got to get better or things can still be total crap, but the character has to be a little bit better equipped to deal with it. So the reader at the end of it can think, okay, this person's a little bit stronger. It's going to be okay. They're going to figure it out. And that's, for me, that's really important in children's literature. But yeah, the world is going to be what it's going to be, but it is that way because of our decisions, all of our decisions, and the decisions that are tiny decisions are also big decisions, how we treat each other as individuals in our town, in our community, how we treat the world around us. I mean, I'm not saying anything new or terribly wise, but I think that's part of the cool thing about children's literature, is that a child's world is generally pretty small, but if the kids reading the books can feel empowered to create justice in that little circle around them, then that's a big deal. And it has, filters out around us.
Yep, absolutely. The empowerment and the hope.
Yeah.
Because when I read that quote, I thought that sounds like Gandhi, but it's actually very different to the Gandhi. And actually, a few months ago, because that quote of Gandhi's, we must be the change we wish to see in the world, that resonated with me so much. And I thought, I'm going to go and find where he said that. He actually didn't say it.
Oh, that's very funny.
He said something like it, but then it was kind of,
Okay.
and that's okay. It still resonates
Yeah.
with me 100%. But I thought we create the world we want to see. And I thought that's really interesting, because it really makes us question what is it we want to see? And is there a part of us, it's drama and sex sells kind of attitude, and pain sells, when we talk about the media, all this sort of stuff. It really brings us back to hang on. Just wait a second here. What do I want to see? Am I enjoying this drama? Is there a part of me that really buys into that?
Yeah.
That's kind of addicted to it? And really bringing ourselves back to, wait, what do I want? What do I want to see?
Yeah.
And then what do I need to be to create that? Sorry, Deb. Yeah.
No, I love that way of you phrasing it. It's like taking a pause and not feeling like you just have to keep going along with the momentum that for whatever reasons we've built in our lives. We get to pause, we get to think about it, we get to decide, we get to have a moment. Like you said, is this really what I want? Or am I just going along with this for the pleasure of the moment of one kind or another? And when when we're able to take that pause as children, that's life-changing, radical, life-changing stuff, to be able to take a pause and really think about what we want when we're kids. Who gets to do that? Very few kids get to do that. So to be able to try to encourage that as reader and a writer, I think that's radically important.
Yeah, 100%. And that pause, it makes me think of Viktor Frankl, and stimulus response, the pause, that's where our freedom is. I've said that completely wrongly, but that's sort of between stimulus and response. In my background here, I've got his book, Yes to Life in Spite of Everything.
Oh, wow. I haven't read that. I'm going to read it.
Yeah. So they're the lectures, a compilation of his lectures that he gave very soon after his freedom had been restored. And yes, giving children, I guess, the understanding that they can pause and they can choose. And, I guess, it's, easier to communicate that to kids whose critical faculties developed, so when they're a little bit older than 7 or 8. But what a gift to actually, because I think a lot of us grow up sort of feeling like we don't have a choice.
Yes. Yeah.
Or not aware that we're not choosing in every moment, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we can become people who just follow trends, who just follow along with leaders that we may or may not agree with. We follow along with food choices that are presented to us without really critically thinking about, is this really good for my body or what? So to be able to take that pause is pretty important.
Yeah, because it also gives us the opportunity to understand, okay, if I'm eating that fast food, I'm making that choice. Why am I making that choice?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. And then if we can think about and feel power over the choices that we make over what we eat, then we feel a bit more empowered to make choices over who we have leading us and whether or not we want them to lead us into war. And, it's like huge stuff, huge stuff.
Huge stuff.
Mm.
One of the questions that arose when I was reading Pavana was, how do you know? I love how you think, you think it's really important that those books end on a hopeful note.
Yeah.
I love that. And some, of course, some of the stuff that's addressed in the book is really in your books is full on.
Yeah.
The part where the children find themselves in what I call chop chop square.
Yes.
Now you don't go into graphic detail, of course, but I was like, wow, okay, there's that's very confronting to an adult. My
Yes.
niece read it and she just took it on face value. She was like, yep, all right, okay. How do you know where the line is in terms of what you
Well,
can?
the line for me is sort of, what do I think I'm capable of writing? There are things that I don't feel like I can write very well. I guess specifically childhood sexual abuse. I'm not sure how I would write about that for young people. There are better people than I who could do that. But for me, in case of the Parvana books, I wanted it to be a fairly accurate representation of what children see, experience, and feel in that situation. And so I had to include those kinds of harsh realities because that's what children on the ground were seeing. And there had to be a way for that child to be able to understand what she was seeing. And there also needed to be a contrast to that. So in that very brutal scene that takes place in the soccer stadiums where people are being tortured and so forth, there are also kind Afghan adults around these children who are like taking care of them in that
Yeah.
moment. Um, and just as when Parvana is reading in the marketplace and she sees this Talib coming to her and wants her to read a letter of his, I needed there to be a humanizing moment for people who are members of the Taliban because they are human beings first and foremost, human beings that we might have huge disagreements with, but unless we can see them first as humans, then we are lost. We have no choice but to kill anybody that we can't find a connection to, and that's just not acceptable. So a lot of kids talk to me about how important that moment was to them, to when the Talib started to cry at the contents of the letter that Parvana read to him because he wasn't capable of reading. He didn't know how to read himself. Um, so it had to be the reality, but also like the worst of us, but also we have this capacity for really great things as well. And don't lose sight of that, even while this horrible stuff is going on.
Yeah. And the idea that in our humanness we have so much more in common than we have
Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
And even people who we perceive as villainous. I mean, I think there are some people who have a sort of a messianic megalomaniacal disorder
Yes.
that creates havoc. There are
Yes.
people like that in the world, but I believe that most of us are trying to get our basic human needs met, to be
Yeah.
loved, to be understood, to
Mhm.
belong.
To
And
feel like we've made a difference in the world in some way.
yep,
Yeah.
and even people who we perceive as being baddies, let's put it that way, they're still people living human lives with those
Yeah.
same needs.
Yes.
It's just like what in this country, some children who are, for example, children of refugees who come here, if they don't find a place to belong, often they fall into unhealthy communities
Yeah.
because they so desperately need to belong somewhere. They need to feel a sense of belonging. And if we don't offer that to them and create that opportunity for them in a positive, constructive way, well, it will be found in a different sort of setting, that's not necessarily going to contribute to their welfare or anybody else's.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, you're totally right on about that.
Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
another, I'm just looking at, I've got so many notes here, Deb, so many questions I wanted to ask. But there was another thing that I found that a child wrote about your writing in 2008. I don't know if you remember this, but it was the My Hero project, and you were her hero. And she wrote, and I'll read this exactly as she wrote it. Deborah Ellis has started to bridge the gap between people from different cultures. By doing this in a way that's interesting, she has enabled young readers to see outside of themselves, to see people their own age suffering in ways that they could not begin to imagine. At the same time, and I love this, at the same time, it doesn't seem like she's trying to scare you. Just open your eyes.
That's lovely.
How profound is that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just open your eyes, because that's the thing. And this is what you're referring to, I imagine, partly when you said you want things to end on a hopeful note, a note of slightly more empowerment, you know?
Yes.
When you talk to children, what are the sorts of questions they have? I know that's probably just, we could talk for hours about that, but what are the sorts of questions they have for you?
Well, some of them are very embarrassing. In not really in a funny way, because
Oh,
so I'll go in when I was doing classrooms, I go in and I talk about like the history of Afghanistan or the history of war and just this and that, and I would get the questions of, so people know this is going on, people know this is happening, people know other people are being hurt, why is it still happening, right? And I have answers for that, but not real answers. I mean, the answers is that we have allowed it to continue. We have allowed people to like so after the Taliban took over the second time back in, I think it was 2021 in August, and there's a mad rush for the airport. We all remember those scenes of people trying to get out of the country, and so the airport looked like it had like a gully around it that was an open sewer, and then there's a fence to the airport, and people were lined up in this open sewer up to their armpits in sewage water, trying to get into the checkpoint that would let them get into the airport. And a bomb exploded, and 70 odd people died in sewer water because they were trying to get to a place of freedom. And we as a world community have allowed that to happen. I mean, why should that happen to anybody? And we continue to allow that to happen by continuing to allow people to make money off of weapons of destruction. And as long as we continue to allow that, we are going to continue to have war. If that profit making for weapons was off the table and no longer allowed, we would find other ways to deal with our conflict. And we wouldn't, those are choices that we have made. And we have to own that. We have to own every one of those people whose deaths died in that terrible way, and all the others who are dying around the world because we have not had the political will to stop people from making money off of weapons. And as soon as you can make money off of weapons, wow, you got to have a place to sell them to. And there's all manner of despotic governments or non-despotic governments who are quite willing to take their taxpayers' money and hand it over for the latest missile system.
and what do you think? Because I've got my own ideas on this, and they may or may not be accurate, but what do you think it is that underlies the lack of political will to make those changes?
It's very easy to fall back onto old patterns and to, get people afraid of one particular group of people or afraid of a different one nation or another. And we're a fairly lazy species in many ways. Okay, someone's telling me this, I'll believe that rather than try to find out for myself how much of that is true and how much of it isn't. To take away the profit motive of weapons of war would require like a seismic shift in the way that we view ourselves and our planet. We're completely capable of that seismic shift. We just haven't done it yet. But oh my God, can you imagine if we did? Can you imagine if we did?
Yeah. I mean, I also think there's a lot of fear underneath it. There's a fear that prevents that change, because for really standing up for it, and for the politicians to really step in and commit to that.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, they're putting their safety on the line, is my opinion.
We're going to be afraid anyway. Right now, I am pretty terrified that we're heading toward nuclear war, and I'm not entirely sure we're going to be able to stop it. So we're either going to be afraid of that, or we're going to be afraid of something else until we get to the point where we learn how to trust each other a little bit better. But the stakes are like hugely high, and so far in Canada, we've escaped that conflagration, which is happening in other parts of the world.
Yeah. And and like we were sort of referring to earlier, it's if we're watching the news, just for example, it's difficult to look at the news and think, yeah, I'm going to trust those people. It's difficult to, because it doesn't promote that. And it's also, trusting without being naive. There are some people who are living their lives at a very different level of consciousness than others. And quite frankly, we can't be naive, put it that way. No.
Well, you're totally right. And whether we're talking about global relationships or interpersonal relationships, like it makes no sense for a woman to keep trusting a man who has shown that over and over again he's going to be abusive. That you just like, get out of my life, dude. But that's not the same as killing off entire chunks of a population. There's got to be some place where we say we're not going to do that anymore, right? It's got to be some way of saying that.
Yeah.
We're not just going to kill a whole bunch of people who've got nothing to do with this conflict.
Absolutely. I mean, God,
it's 2023, for heaven's sakes.
Do you feel a huge weight of responsibility when you're writing fiction about situations that are happening right now? I mean, this is probably a silly question. Is it a huge weight of responsibility that you feel when you're writing about current situations?
Yeah, it's important to get it as right as possible. And as a white Canadian, there's things I'm never going to understand. But it's important to try to understand as much as possible and to get it as close to right as I possibly can. It's also, books are sacred, and books are great because some books, you pick them up, you read them, they're not for you, toss them aside, off you go. Other books, you pick them up and you start to read them and they become part of you, especially the books that we read when we're kids. When we're kids, we tend to read our favorites over and over and over again, and they become part of our DNA almost. So writing for young people is a very sacred task, because it could be a book that helps shape who that person is, for better, for worse, for whatever. And so that's a task I take very seriously.
So, and what were your favorite books growing up? What were your influences?
I lived in a small town, so I read any books that took place in New York City. We had a great Canadian writer named Jean Little, who just passed a couple of years ago, who also wrote wonderful books about ordinary families and the way that they relate to each other. and kindness and just wonderful stuff like that.
Mm.
That you can get great drama out of small interactions. It's
Yep.
wonderful.
Yep. And how, as as you've lived your life and gained experience, how's your writing changed?
Sometimes it seems to get harder. I don't know if my brain is changing or something, but sometimes it seems like I've got all these threads on a novel I'm rewriting again for like the 20th time, and I just can't get them all meshed in together. So sometimes it seems harder, and other times it seems like, okay, I know how to do this. I can figure this out. I can get it put together. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I guess I've become a little bit more philosophical about it, in that if this book doesn't work out, maybe I'll be able to do a better job on the next one, because I know I've done other books that have worked out. So that helps a little bit, but blank page is still a blank page, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when you kind of, really, I was talking to another author about this, and I said, when you're lacking inspiration, like you just can't, if it's just not coming. And she said, "Oh, you mean writer's block?" And I was like, "Oh, I suppose that is what it is." But I think I just thought of it as when it's just not coming, it's not flowing.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking of listeners who do other creative things when it's not flowing. I'm just curious what you do, like what strategies you've developed. Do you go for a walk? Do you just forget about it? Do you, cuddle a dog? Or, I mean, what do you do to just kind of let it go and see what you can free, I guess?
Yeah, you'd think I would have learned to have done something like that. I tend to get very stubbornly on a road that I know is the wrong road, but bloody heck, that's the road I'm on, and I got to just keep following it, even though it means I'm going to end up tearing up all those pages and it's going to lead me nowhere. So sometimes you just have to write a lot of nonsense and garbage before you find what it is that you're trying to write about, and that's, for me, that's just the way the process goes.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's a strategy, that's a way in and of itself, isn't it? It's kind of,
Yeah,
following that doggedly to the end,
yeah,
whatever the end is, and then you've sort of done it, right?
yeah, 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 yeah.
So one of the quotes I'm just look if viewers, if you see me looking up, it's because I've got this ream of questions and notes on Deb up here. And really, one of the things that I read, Deb, that just resonated, and we've talked about it, but you sum it up so beautifully in this quote. And again, it might be one that you've forgotten you wrote, but it's, books can help us remember what we have in common. And
Yeah.
certainly your books do that. And the scene in One More Mountain that you mentioned,
Yeah.
that really happened, in,
Yeah.
the people who were trying to get to safety and the bomb went off. You read that, and I remember when it happened. Of course, I remember when it really happened.
Yes.
And it's devastating. And in reading both the fictional account and really what happened, it's unifying. And I'm not trying to put a positive spin on something that was absolutely dreadful and should never have happened. But when we are able to connect with somebody else's suffering without glamorizing it, of course, we're not experiencing. So we can't connect with it in the way that someone who really experienced that, of course, does, or someone who whose parent died in that situation or something like that. But it really brings us back to what we all have in common.
What we all have in common, in that our ability to feel grief and pain and to suffer and to also look at a situation like what happened at the airport fence as a way of maybe one day universally we will be able to say we're not going to let that happen again. We're not going to put people in those situations again. We're going to do better because we can do better. That's a useful thing in terms of looking at that. A book can also be, like a novel, can also be somewhat of a historical document, even though it's a fictional thing. And the world moves very quickly. We get atrocity on top of atrocity. And I wanted to include that scene so that we can continue to remember that those people who passed on that day and what their losses meant to all of us in the world, huge losses
Yes.
of us, and that none of that needed to happen. We could have done a better job of that whole situation. So I want to remember them.
Yes. And the point is, isn't it, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
What are we going to do about it? And I haven't read this series of books where you, I'm looking at my notes, where you wrote about 9 children, I think, from different places in the world. And
oh, okay.
What series is that?
There's a couple of books of short stories. One's called Sit, one's called Step, and they're children in different parts of the world dealing with things that they deal with. They're short stories.
Yeah. And I think it was the Sit collection the Sit stories that I was reading about, and there was something in the description of those, and I'm looking at my notes, but it really stood out to me that each of those children, I'm just trying to find it here. Yes, it was from Sit. So each child makes a decision and takes action.
Yeah.
And that's where the sense of empowerment lies, isn't it?
Yes. 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 Even as children, there are things that we are capable of doing, and we don't give children enough credit for that. And we never gave ourselves enough credit for that when we were children. Speaking for myself in my own childhood anyway, we believe the stories that we're told that we don't have power, and anything that we can put out into the world that changes that story, that gives kids and grown kids, adult kids, a reminder that we do have the power to shift things in our lives. And I mean, that's monumental.
Monumental. And just in reading that, Deb, for me, I thought, what's my next decision? What action am I going to take? So you've inspired me to make a decision and take some action. And listeners and viewers, I'm just putting it out there as a suggestion. What decision might you make, or what action might you take? However apparently small. Deb, is there anything that I haven't asked you about that or anything that we haven't addressed that you would like to address?
I would like to say a big hello to everybody that's listening, and to thank them for listening to this, and remind everybody again that we have more power than we remember to shape the world in a way that we want it to be shaped. We don't have to put up with the way things are. We can make choices.
Absolutely. Deb, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I had a really great time talking with you.
I did too. It's been wonderful and inspiring for me. And I really am grateful that you were willing to share on so many different levels, your experience, what you want for the world, what you see for the world as possible, and those simple things, decisions, actions, not underestimating the impact we can have.
Yeah.
And on that note, the little girl who wrote that paragraph that I read, I believe she entitled her essay, The Power of One Voice. And you have certainly made a huge difference, Deb, in all of the ways that you've contributed to this world. And let's all of us just consider that for ourselves. What could the power of our voice do in this world? What difference could it make? So
it's a wonderful question.
Thanks again, Deb. Well, you prompted it, so thank you. And listeners and watchers, once again, thank you so much. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. I'm so grateful to all of you. And I look forward to joining with you on the waves next time. Thanks, everyone. Bye.